Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into what happens when our body's own little biochemical assembly lines break down. I mean, what happens when just one tiny step in a crucial pathway goes wrong? Well, the consequences can be huge, and that's what we're going to unpack.
So let's kick things off with a big question, one that's really at the heart of a whole class of genetic diseases. Imagine a factory, right? You've got this perfect assembly line, but suddenly one worker who does one very specific job just doesn't show up. What happens? Well, all the parts start piling up at their station, and the final product, it never gets finished. That is a perfect analogy for what's happening inside our bodies at a molecular level.
And that is what we call an inborn error of metabolism. It's basically a genetic typo, a fault in a single enzyme or a transporter protein. This one little glitch throws a wrench in the whole system, causing a toxic pileup of whatever that enzyme was supposed to be working on. And that buildup can do real damage to critical places like the brain, the skin, and our connective tissues.
All right, let's make this real by looking at some disorders involving what are called aromatic amino acids. And we're going to start with the classic example, the one every single medical student has to know inside and out, phenylketonuria, or as you'll hear it, PKU.
Okay, so here's that factory line we were talking about. Normally, an amino acid called phenylalanine is supposed to get converted into another one called tyrosine. Simple enough. But in PKU, the enzyme that does that job, phenylalanine hydroxylase, is broken. It's just not working. And that creates a complete blockade. So what's the immediate result? Phenylalanine has nowhere to go. It just starts to build up in the body's tissues and blood.
Now, this pileup isn't harmless. It actually triggers a whole cascade of serious problems. Those high levels of phenylalanine are incredibly toxic to the brain, and they can lead to severe intellectual disability and seizures. The body also tries to get rid of the excess by shunting it down other pathways, which creates something called phenylacetate. And that gives the urine a very distinct, musty or mousy odor. And get this, because tyrosine, which is the precursor for melanin, isn't being made, patients often have really fair skin and light hair. It all connects.
So how do we fix this? Well, the logic is actually pretty straightforward. If you can't process the raw material, you have to stop supplying it. A diet that's super low in phenylalanine is the absolute cornerstone of treatment. And since tyrosine isn't being made anymore, it suddenly becomes an essential amino acid for these patients, so you have to supplement it in their diet. And this is exactly why newborn screening for PKU is so incredibly critical. Catch it early, and you can prevent the damage.
Now let's stick with that same metabolic pathway, but we're going to move a little further down the line. So phenylalanine becomes tyrosine, and then tyrosine gets broken down even further. In a condition called alkaptonuria, the block happens at the enzyme homogenicitic acid oxidizer. This time, the thing that piles up is an intermediate called homogenicitic acid.
And this accumulation leads to a completely different and honestly a very striking set of symptoms. The most famous one is that the person's urine will literally turn black if you let it sit out and get exposed to air. Over time, that same homogenicic acid builds up as a dark pigment in connective tissues, a condition we call achronosis. You can actually see it as a dark blue or black color in the cartilage of the ears and nose. And that same deposit in the joints leads to some really nasty arthritis later in life.
But what if the problem isn't a toxic pileup, but the exact opposite? A failure to produce something your body really needs? Well, that's exactly what's going on in albinism. In this branch of the pathway, tyrosine is the starting material for making melanin, the pigment that gives color to our skin, hair, and eyes. But here, the enzyme tyrosinase is defective.
The result is pretty much what you'd expect, a complete or partial lack of melanin. This leads to that characteristic hypopigmentation. But melanin isn't just for looks, it's our body's natural sunscreen. Without it, people with albinism are incredibly sensitive to sunlight, which means they have a much higher risk of skin cancer. And they often experience photophobia, a real intolerance to light because there's no pigment in the iris of their eye to block out the glare.
And this just brilliantly illustrates a key concept, doesn't it? You have two different diseases, alkaptonuria and albinism, both caused by defects in the exact same tyrosine metabolism pathway. Yet one is a disease of accumulation, a pileup that causes dark pigments and arthritis. The other is a disease of deficiency, a failure to produce a final product leading to a lack of protection. It's just a perfect example of how different blocks in the same line can lead to wildly different clinical outcomes.
Okay, now that we've really explored the phenylalanine pathway, let's do a quick rapid-fire round on a few other high-yield defects.
Think of this as the stuff you absolutely need to have locked in for your exams.
First up, maple syrup urine disease, or MSUD. Here, the problem is breaking down the branched-chain amino acids. That's leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So they and their byproducts build up. And the name? It comes from the fact that the baby's urine has this characteristic sweet smell, just like maple syrup. But it's not cute. That smell is a huge red flag for a neurological emergency that can cause severe brain damage if it's not caught and treated right away.
Next on our list is homocystinuria. In this one, a defect in an enzyme called cystathionine beta synthase causes homocysteine to build up, and homocysteine is really bad news for our connective tissue and our blood vessels. Clinically, patients can have skeletal problems that look a bit like Marfan syndrome. They can get atherosclerosis really early in life, and here's the key sign to look for: downward dislocation of the lens in the eye. That's a classic clue. Finally, let's clear up two conditions that sound almost identical but are totally different: cystinuria and cystinosis. It all comes down to the location of the problem. In cystinuria, it's a transport issue in the kidneys. A protein that's supposed to reabsorb the amino acid cysteine is broken. So cysteine builds up in the urine and forms incredibly painful kidney stones. On the other hand, cystinosis is a storage problem inside the cells themselves. A transporter that's supposed to get cysteine out of the lysosomes is broken. So cysteine crystals build up inside the cells all over the body, leading to widespread organ damage and eventually renal failure. Two very different beasts.
All right, let's wrap this all up. To really help you nail this for your studies, we're going to create a clear, high-yield blueprint for revision. These are the absolute must-know connections.
This is where the rubber meets the road. This slide boils each complex disorder down to its absolute essence. For PKU, you see phenylalanine hydroxylase. You think musty odor. For alkaptonuria, it's homogenicitic acid oxidase and that black urine. MSUD, the branched-chain enzyme defect leads to sweet-smelling urine. And for homocystinuria, that cystathionine beta synthase deficiency is all about that downward lens dislocation. These are the key associations that you've got to have cold for your exams.
And, to help all of this actually stick in your brain when you're under pressure, a good mnemonic can be a lifesaver. So here's one for you. Please always act more honest, careful. Each word helps you recall one of the key disorders: PKU, alkaptonuria, albinism, MSUD, homocystinuria, and cystinuria. It's a super useful tool for quick recall during a test.
And all of this brings us to one final, pretty big thought. Every single one of these complex, sometimes devastating clinical syndromes, they all start from a single, tiny error in our genetic blueprint. Right now, we manage them by changing diets or treating the symptoms. But when we look to the future, the ultimate goal seems pretty clear, right? Can we go beyond just managing the downstream effects and actually use tools like gene therapy to go in and fix the blueprint itself? That's the question that's going to drive the next generation of medicine.